deeply honored to welcome you all in the sixth day of this online lecture series, organized by the Department of English, Kharagpur College, in collaboration with the Department of English, EGRA SSB College. And it gives me immense pleasure to express a hearty welcome to our speaker, Dr. Shubhadeep Paul, who gives his kind consent to be our speaker for today, managing his busy schedule. Dr. Paul was the former assistant professor in English, Maulana Azad College, Kolkata. Presently, he is the assistant professor of Bankura University. His area of interest include studies of the Orient and the Occident, cultural theory, Scottish studies, critical reflections on popular culture, 21st century Shakespeare studies, ethics, and creative writing. Apart from this, his field of specialization is post-colonial and new literature, multiculturalism and multicultural literature, Indian writing in English, American literature, diaspora studies, cultural representation of Hollywood, literature and trauma, literature of the border, post-humanism and critical appropriation of futurism. He has presented many insightful papers at several conferences. Besides this, a dozen of his research articles have been published in reputed national and international journals. Today, he will deliver a lecture on imaginary homelands and real homelessness, post-colonial diasporas, and transnational contestation. And as I have listened to some of his online lectures, I can say that they are very well researched and beneficial too. And our audience must be enthusiastically waiting to hear him. So, Dr. Paul, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shreyoshi, for that wonderful introduction. I, at the very outset, thank Kharagpur College and EGRA College, who have jointly decided to organize this lecture series. And initially, I felt that the terrain of transnationalism on which I have been working for some time is so vast that it doesn't give me the scope to narratize the whole thing in the scope of only one lecture. So I decided to break it down into 3 lectures in 3 different institutions. And this is the last of them, as I had mentioned on social media yesterday. Now, I would like to thank, Pothik and Shishir and all the other faculty members whom I might not be able to name for inviting me over. And I hope that this will be a lecture where I would be not only dealing with some theoretical nuances, but I would be talking about something which is, I think, very close to all of us, the idea of home, the many different kinds of homes that we go through, the way we become homeboys and homegirls, the way we have feelings of homelessness, which may be, tangible and which may also be psychological. And at the same time, what constitutes the, multifaceted order of the idea of home today. So based on that, there is a certain trajectory that I'm trying to, harp on today. And let's see where it, leads to. So at the end of the lecture, if you have your observations, which I really cherish a lot, please feel free to state them across, because the organizers have given me a lot of time today. I have around 2 hours at my disposal, so I will definitely be very happy to see how the reception of the paper goes. So quite evidently, as the title of my paper shows, to understand the significance or significations of homelands, which might be real or imaginary, And also the idea of homelessness, which can be defined in many different ways, both real and figurative. We must first understand the etymological and a more macrocosmic understanding of the teleology of home. Now, conceptual figurations of the idea of home is multifarious, but if I can zero down all the different observations that I have found in critical parlance as well as in many different creative works, the most commonsensical idea of home is it is a place where the heart is. That's how I think a home is distinguished from a house or a structure, a monolithic or a multipartite structure where the spatial dimension of residence is there. I would mention that I happen to receive part of my early education in a Scottish missionary school called Dr. Graham's Homes in Kalimpong. And as you can understand, the very name of the school is homes. It's a place where the boarders, they are made to feel at home. It's a place where we don't have maybe relationship ties by blood, but where we form these kinships that stay with us. It's not only a formal alma mater, but it's a place where we time and again return to. It's a place where we feel that it's there in our memory. It will always be there in our memory. So home is definitely where the heart is. And this means that it is a dear, informal resting place. I would use the word resting place because at the end of the day, no matter how busy you are, that is where you come to rest. That is where you get your daily quota of sleep. So it is also akin to the cervical contours of the maternal womb, which is nourished by the amniotic fluid. And also after death, we rest and receive peace, peace or shanti, where there is the rest in peace idea. And that's there in the tomb, which is also a sacred terrain. It's a sacred place. And if the human body is burned, then the ashes go to the Ganges. So that's also a sort of a repertoire where there is a certain idea of containment of the body. So both the womb and the tomb are our original homes, from where we hail and where we return. So there is a process of circularity at work. And this may also be linked with the idea of diasporic emigration, return, reintegration, so on and so forth. So both longing and belonging is associated with the idea of home. There is a sense of feudal, proto-capitalist ownership also involved here. Maybe the way monogamous matrimonial partnerships and conjugalities are involved and the way they evolve. So there is the idea of the family man, for instance, and the virtuous spouse. So the locus of the containment of these subjective configurations is the home. To which there are people who may or may not subscribe to, but general parlance informs us that it is like that. However, the way Aftar Bra notes in the book Cartographies of Diaspora, Contesting Identities, it's a very landmark book released by Routledge, where the idea of home is defined in the following words. It's a mythic place of desire in the diasporic imagination. So there is a certain idea of mythicization involved in the whole thing. The place of origin is a zone, or it might also be a geographical territory that we can return to over and over again, but which is fundamentally a place of no return. A place whose ontological verity and the subject's epistemological configuration of the same can never match. So, for instance, like when we talk about our school days, when we talk about our school or schools, if you, like me, happen to study in more than one school, you would know that there is a physical idea of the school that is there, which is settled in our minds, and which has to do with the teachers and our friends, schoolmates, and classmates involved. So, when we return to the school, maybe there is a certain degree of affinity that we find, but at the same time we find that there are a lot of things which are changed, immensely changed. The school structure doesn't resemble the same, or the teachers are not familiar, and of course the students are in maybe different uniforms. So the identification with the home factor is a very important thing to be considered. So let's put it this way, that it's a place of no return, and correspondingly, home is also an idealization of reality, and which is why the interior spatialization of the place is meaningfully configured. Let me point out a couple of ideas here, ideas that I found replicated in a lot of books, like of course, and a lot of essays as well. Like you have Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space, which is by, I think, Beacon Press, Boston. And of course, the very, very influential postmodern geographies, The Reassertion of Space in Critical Social Theory by Edward Soya. And there you have the idea that there is, of course, the physical manifestation of contours. Like, for instance, when we go to purchase an apartment, we talk about the square feet, the square feet expanse, and we talk about terms like the super built area and of course the carpet area. So there are several things which are not taken into consideration. Like I remember when I purchased an apartment in Kolkata, the promoter told me that the box area, which is the area which is carved out for keeping the almiras, is not to be considered in the total configuration. And of course, there are manipulations here and there for evasion of taxes and all that. So let's put it this way, that the entirety of the house, the complete physical dimension, is not where we rest. Like, for instance, my father actually belongs to the whole house, but maybe he is nestled only on his bed, or maybe on the hammock, or on the rocking chair. So and part of the WC. So he is located there. He doesn't really configure in the entire terrain. So we have these, ideas which might seem peculiar to you, but which I found to be very interesting in the way our psychological configuration of the psychospatial ordering of our homes is concerned. If you, of course, get to choose and order your home in a particular manner, if there is no choice, but all of us have some bit of choice, even if it's a completely furnished apartment that we purchase, where we can't really decide on the contours of the apartment or the house or the land, we get to make our subjective configurations done. So in this context, I would refer to Henry Lefebvre's tripartite postulation of space. Lefebre talks about the perceived space, the conceived space, and the lived space. And this applies befittingly to the idea of the spatialization of home, as evidenced from the book, The Production of Space. As against the people-less conceived space, the realm of the lived space is more personal. It is often an interactive zone between perceived and conceived spaces. So when, again, Edward Soya talks about the second space, he refers to imagined representations of spatiality. And in referring to Lefebre, he highlights the manipulations in spatiality that always take place when we talk of the home and the idea of what lies beyond the home as well. One interesting example that I can give you in the case of multi-apartment residencies, usually in the metropolis, is that of spaces like the WM Boot, like the Watchman's Boot. The Watchman's Boot is a contested area because the watchman is part of the residence, the complex, the total complex, yet he is outside it. And that is a space which is common to all the people who have purchased apartments in that respective complex. So it is a common space, and the common space is part of the privileges that we get to enjoy. Likewise, the roof being another example. So let me now come to some textual examples. Like when we talk about Tagore's Ghore Baire and Ghore and Baire, the home and the beyond, or we in general talk about Rushdie's fictionalizing the idea of imaginary homelands in his works, many different works, of course. The geopolitical spatialization of the home is pushed to the cartography of the mind. So please note it that the idea of the home is not restricted to the idea of the walls and the fans and the furniture alone. It also has to do with the way our cartographical configurations of the mind conceive of these spaces, how we utilize that, how certain things are very dear to us and certain things are absolutely or maybe pseudo discardable. So that is subjective. That depends on our individual choices. As against the traditional idea of home as your claimed ontological verity by virtue of birth, you see, like there is the idea of how a space becomes our own by the very virtue of the fact that we have taken birth there. We call birth bhumishto hawa. So we actually relate the place of birth, the site of birth, in terms of a certain kind of ownership, so that becomes a very sacred place for us, which place we have been born, and whether we had a home there or not, whether the nursing home is something which is special to us or not, which kind of family members were there during our birth. So these things keep on happening. Like I talk of myself as a Calcutta boy, Kolkata is still there. But I feel that, I didn't spend my childhood here because every year we used to come to Calcutta to visit my maternal grandfather's house. But I was born in Calcutta. I was born in a nursing home called EDF in South Kolkata. So South Kolkata becomes a very, dear place to me and a place which is very known to me. The alleys and the oligolis are all known to me, and I have two residences there. So it is something which is very personal, and this idea of personalization can operate in a myriad ways. So we have to understand that a home today not only is the spatial suspension of belonging, but it is a multifaceted dispersion in terms of multi-locality. So in terms of diaspora theory, I also find this, and I might be rambling a little because I would be talking about a lot of issues taken together, so you'd have to bear with me. But it is not a straightforward narrativization of things that I'm attempting here. I'm going to different trajectories of thought processes, so I'm trying to assimilate all of that together. So initially you had the idea of diasporic suspension, being in a limbo. You had the Trishanku image, being neither here nor there, suspended midway, straddling midway, and that has given way to the idea of multi-locality in transnationalism, where you are one in terms of your physical attribute, because ontologically speaking, the human body can belong to only one place at one point of time. But then there are many different ways in which we can through metaphoric ways and symbolic ways and technological ways, we can belong to many different places at the same time. And this idea of multi-locality is very important, because we can even have different homes at different places. It's not a singular idea which is at work. Like there was a gentleman who told me some days back that I have never spent a night outside my home. No matter how busy I was, I always had to come back to my home, and I had to stay with my family members. I said, well, you are very lucky in this kind of a shifty age. Because as for myself, I can't tell you that, because I have maybe for a project work, I was in Cherrapunji, or maybe I was researching in Shillong, or maybe, I don't know, tomorrow I might be in Kolkata, completely alone in my, might be somewhere else, in a youth hostel in Tokyo. So I never know where I am posited, and every place, every space that we occupy becomes a sort of a personalized space. That's my contention. But then we don't claim it. Like after you leave a hotel room, for instance, the place is carefully described of your presence. There are new bed covers, and there are new furniture covers, and the whole room is redone, and it's made pristine. But that's not the way our subjective homes are subjected to. Like we might not be existing in a place for a very long time, but after we come back, we find the things are just like that. So sometimes we have a déjà vu. Become a little sullied and dirtied, but they are still the same. So it's a wonderful feeling that way. There is a television advertisement in Bangla, which goes something like this: "Apnar bari, apnar porichoy." Most of you are familiar with that idea that your identity is your house, or your house determines your identity, or your residence determines your identity. And this word body can also mean home and house alike, because, well, if you are a very material person, then the very idea of body becomes very tangible to your identity. Amar bishal body, I have a huge house, or you live in a small flat, or you don't have your own house, you live in a rented place. We tend to do these kind of things. We look down upon people who maybe are less fortunate than us. And then we also have, like ideas of name tags associated with houses, like different houses having different names. Like there is a house adjacent to my house here, which has a huge icon of Lord Ganesha on it, a typical thing that people do in non-metropolitan areas. And we call it the Ganesh Bari because it features a Ganesh. So it's as simple as that. Whereas in cities, you might actually have names of apartments, piano, which gives it a certain subjective dimension. Anyway, so there is a linking of the materiality of the residence and its specific address, and the important role here, because the poshness of your house, or the lack of it, and its locational advantage or disadvantage in determining your identity. Like, I'll give you another example. I'm giving some anecdotal references for the sake of your understanding. In my university, I have a friend, come colleague, who teaches in the Department of Mathematics. And in Kolkata, he has an apartment quite close to the place where my second apartment is there. And my second apartment is close to a metro station, a metro railway station. It's close to the main road. We have very posh businessmen around. I have the Mukhorochok Chanachur's having his residence close to me. And after the metro is over, there is a khal, there is a sullied, dirty water body. And on the other side of the khal, there are smaller apartments. So he has his apartment there. And he says that, no, we stay at the same place, but that khal makes a lot of difference. You are on this side of the khal and I'm on that side of the khal. So maybe the price factor, the whole value added, latent value added to your apartment is quite different from that related to mine. So these are some of the subjective investments that we keep making into our flats time to time. South facing or not, east open or not, how much of sun and air is coming and not, how much green cover is there or not. So a lot of things, marble cover or not. So these are some of the things that determine the way our material specification is done. And yet, let me remind you, none of this might have anything to do with the way our homeliness is constructed. You can live in an absolutely ramshackle kuder bari, in an absolutely run-down abode, okay? And yet it might be very, very dear to you. Okay, so I remember having a Bihari friend in my school, and every year during the Chhat Pujo, I used to go to his house for having tekuas, and his father worked in a pawn shop, so they were not well off, and he was very shy to take me to his place, and yet since we were close friends, we used to go. And I found that much of the shyness came from the fact that the house had such a poor decor about it. But that did not really interfere with our friendship or with the way we had tekuas together. My main agenda was this subjective investment of mutuality, not the way his house was constructed. So the idea of homeliness is maybe predicated on several other things than what we habitually learn to be. That is why I think when I go to Salt Lake City in Kolkata, I have heard my friends say that, well, Vishal Bari, big houses, but absolutely soulless. Maybe there is one elderly person inside, or a husband and wife who are octogenarians, and all their sons and daughters and grandchildren are abroad. So it has a very strong foundation structure attached to it, but it might be soulless. So whether the idea of being soulful is related to the idea of homelessness is something we can definitely talk about. And it also tickles the bourgeois sentiment that unless you possess your own house or apartment, you are in a way spaced out. You have in a way an identity-less position. And at the same time, let me point out, to stay in your father's house after a certain point of time, in Bangla we call it Baper Hotel, or to stay before I actually got my first full-time job. So it's not something that is to be looked down upon, but mainly because I did not want to go to my Pishi's house, which was outside Kolkata. It was a huge house, and she was absolutely childless and looked at me and my brother as her children. But because we needed to stay in the city for our education, we put up in a rented place, and we had to bear a lot of ostracization and torture because of that. Like, you are always a second-class citizen if you are in a mess or in a rent. And at the same time, maybe if your relationship with your landlord is good, it might actually be something else. Whatever it might be, the etymological sense of homelessness is also associated along with our homing. Oftentimes we may find ourselves at some place where our body is there, but our minds are not there. Like I have heard some of my colleagues tell me who maybe are not natives of Bakura that, only their body is there. Their minds and their mindscapes and their heartscapes belong to somewhere else. It's not that with me. I particularly feel that whichever place I inhabit, and maybe that has also got to do with the fact that I have changed my residencies multiple times during my childhood, because my father, every time he used to get a promotion in the private sector, we used to go to a bigger bungalow. And so we were always shifty. We were always on the run. And maybe there are a lot of you who might have, you might be still living in that house where you have been born. Or you might have technically taken your birth in that house. So it's a different experience for different people. Let's not take a universal stance on that. So home has several markers of definitional understanding, but evidently one thing is very clear, which is home is an entity where a multi-checkered subjectivity has been invested. The word home has emotions, sentiments, and memory associated with it. It remains fluid and amorphous, and the plasmic verity has a profound bearing on our minds, which may be nostalgic or traumatic, depending on the nature of homing involved. This is why Chandra Talpade Mohanty regards the being at home, a quote-unquote idea, with amniotic bliss, which is basically familiarity, safety, protection, nourishment, and all these parallel ideas that we associate with the idea of home. The worst experience, veritably nightmarish, is when home becomes an illusion or illusory referent. And that is where I would come to my take on homelessness, that maybe homelessness can happen due to a lot of unfortunate factors. You might have seen in Amitabh Ghosh's where Rajkumar, the central character, has several fluctuations in his life. You know, there are pyramidal up and downs in his life, where at one point of time he stays in a wonderful mansion, and then the war comes, and after the war comes, he loses everything. He starts again from scratch, and then he again attains a certain degree of economic security and respectability. So this is the age that we belong to, where there is no common assertion to be made. Likewise, so the subject of belonging has undergone and keeps undergoing massive modulations with time. Belongingness, both personal and collective, is fractured. The idea of physical dismemberment of mutilated bodies, when we talk of cataclysmic events like partition, the Rohingya crisis, the Holocaust, etc., can be related to the idea of the home as well, where family members get estranged. So, see, when we talk about dismemberment, let's say the house has broken down. The house has been broken down for promoting, and the personal ties of the joint family being sundered. Or it might also be that when we talk about dismemberment, these kind of cataclysmic events happen, and maybe the family gets separated, they get estranged, the daughter is abducted, there are family members who are missing, and that is how the whole unified membership of the family gets split up. Well, you might even relate it to the slave narratives in American literature, like Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, where you find that Uncle Tom is completely separated from his family. There are moments when he sits on the boat, or he sits on the outside hovel, and he starts ruminating about his wife or his kids, and he starts missing them. So there is this contention to be thought about. And at the same time, the partition and the pre-partition riots in Calcutta, Howrah, and Dhaka are also reminiscent of communal brutalities that speak of another kind of dismembering. The idea of severing the male member, the penis, for instance, so that the communal mark can be given. This is something I've heard, from some of the fieldwork that I have done, that during the communal riots that used to take place earlier, or that had taken place during the post-partition and the pre-partition milieu, that maybe the Hindu rioters used to kill a couple of Muslim people and sever their private organs, and to bring that was a sort of a trophy that you had attained one step ahead of your false glory. Of course, the idea of sacrality and security and the point of return signified by the home gets subverted and disrupted when we talk of these kind of inflammatory conditions like border crossings in war zones, life in refugee camps, the new age fear in citizenship lack related areas, like let's put it citizenless ghettoization. Of course, we have had a lot of debate on that, the detention camps and everything, and of course the fanatical rhetoric of ethnic cleansing of milieus like 1947, 1971, 1994. The Babri Masjid demolition was a milieu that I have witnessed with my own eyes, and this rips open the exigencies of survival that are predicated on, let's put it, precarity. I can also give you another anecdote, which is very kind of traumatological for me. That when I talked about the rented apartment where I stayed for 10 years, I noticed that the doors of that house are, of a certain order. Like there is an Islamic design to those doors. They have large circles and blocks, which is not normally found in the regular shops. So I asked the landlord that from where did you buy these doors? They're wonderful. And he said that we didn't buy them. There were these riots when the Muslims used to stay on the other side of the other para, as we called it, and they were all driven out. We drove them out, and they have now been ghettoized in places like Kamal Gaji and maybe deeper south that way towards Baruipur, the larger extension of the South Chobbish Pargona as we know it. And when they just fled their homes, these Hindu people, they unlatched those doors, they brought it home and they planted it in their own homes. So this is also very interesting, but very disturbing at the same time, that how different homes get transplanted and supplanted on each other, time after time, and how there are intersections that are very disturbing that we have to keep in mind. So let me put it this way, that when we talk about partition fiction, which is of course not something very new, when we talk about Khushwant Singh, Qurratullain Haider, we talk about Bishop, we also talk about a struggle to give an aesthetic articulation to the anguish of forced homelessness. This is not an easy task. You see, like whenever you are narrativizing it, you are giving a certain aesthetic design to it. And aesthetics has to have a proper idea of design, But these cataclysmic events are so designless, or they are so, let's put it that way, chaotic in their very natures, resulting in several kinds of disruptions, that the very act of giving a sort of design to these narratives is traumatological. It is highly traumatic. It is highly disturbing in itself. So I would advise my students and scholars to definitely refer to a landmark book, Malashri Lal and Sukrita Paul Kumar's book, Interpreting Homes in South Asian Literature. This is by Dorlink in the Slay, released in 2007, marketed by Pearson, which tries to articulate the idea of homing with respect to an unorthodox approach to the idea of the point of origin, thereby rendering us to several possibilities of homing and homelessness. One familiar example to all of you, like King Lear's being the unaccommodated man, from being originally the regally accommodated king, monarch. Now, the qualifier of being driven out of the palace is also, akin to the idea of being driven out of the hearts of his loved ones, his loved daughters. And of course, he is tremendously pained to see a non-response from Cordelia's side. And we know that this has interrelational possibilities. The idea of the cord, from there you have the idea of the cordial behavior towards human beings, the idea of cordiality in general, the idea of the umbilical cord, which is separated during birth, but which has some bit of maternal interrelation once again happening time and time again. And then, of course, you have the antonyms to that as well, uncordial behavior, resulting in both Cordelia's and Lear's death down the line. So Lear's psycho-emotive anguish is also a case point of what I would say is a literal vagrancy, acknowledging that poor Tom's hovel was hardly a home for Lear. King Lear, and the fool's subaltern spatialization of psycho-emotive accommodation not proving enough for the over-pampered king, who is a seeker of maternal refuge. So in that sense, the word refugee should not be a disparaging term, because we are all seeking refuge. I have found a tendency in diasporic literature and criticism that we tend to give a certain amount of weightage to the migrant, the cosmopolitan migrant, but we tend to treat people who fall under the categorizations of refugeehood, or who might be asylum seekers, who might be prisoners of war. We treat them as disposable entities, which is not right, because maybe they are not naturalized citizens. There are, of course, cases of illegal immigrants as well. But then, speaking about it from a more holistic standpoint, we have to understand that every person who is born on this planet has the human rights to live somewhere, with dignity and to be of some help to some category of people. So even if you are in prison, or you are in a lunatic asylum, or you are a controversial writer or a politician who has sought refuge at a particular place in some different country, you are not a despicable or disposable commodity. You have a humanized entity which is to be protected. So based on that, this is what I find with Jhumpa Lahiri's collection of 8 longish short stories called Unaccustomed Earth, which is predicated on a shifty planet ridden by hurricanes, tsunamis, viral diseases, military upheavals, constantly forcing us into ontological uncertainties and epistemological pluralities that raise in us the question as to how we are to inhabit this earth, where much of our earthy whims and desires remain uncurated. The idea of home expands or contracts depending on our viewing lenses and their magnifying or zooming powers. So Rakesh Sharma, when he is viewing Earth from space, he told Indira Gandhi that when I could see the cartographical dimension, the delineation of my motherland, India, I had this nostalgic feeling that, yes, my home is out there. So, with more progressive distance, the idea of home also tends to have a more macrocosmic expanse or expansion. A mother, this is a very wonderful example that I feel you should take into account, that when a mother is taking into account the fact that she is instructing her daughter or son who is settled abroad, and telling her about the cooking process, the culinary process, or the recipe formulation of a certain particular, let's say, native dish via Skype, a Skype conversation, the boundary, the spatial dimension of the home gets expanded. You see, the mother and the daughter, they actually live in different locations. But this is how multi-locality takes place. You know, like it's as in drama. I mentioned in one of my previous lectures that in case of the fourth wall realism, one particular wall is something which becomes transparent. It collapses. So there is a transparency. There is a multi-local transparency, a multinational transparency, which is at work. And which is very interesting because that really takes away much of our, let's put it that way, spatial trouble. And that is very encouraging, so to say. In most expansive sense taken into consideration, this will be a nowhere identity in operation. And this is very dangerous. You know, like I have seen in the case of the more established diasporic writers, you know, let's put it that way, the more popular writers, the one among the top league, and of course the more influential diasporic writers, the more we should also take this into account, the highest paid diasporic writers, they have this nowhere identity also, which has to be given a certain treatment when we talk about the idea of homing. So let me go back to your very well-known The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri, certain observation from that novel. True to the meaning of her name, she will be without borders, without a home of her own, a resident everywhere and nowhere. Lahiri is talking about Oshima, the mother of Gogol Ganguly. And you find the very name Oshima, you know, like the boundless, is very much there. And of course, she realizes that after a certain point of time, that she is somebody's wife, somebody's mother, somebody's daughter. But beyond that, she is also someone who can expand her personal contours beyond time and space. At the same time, Lahiri harks back to Nathaniel Hawthorne's the very wonderful custom house introductory in the Scarlet Letter, in the very popular 19th century novel called the Scarlet Letter, which goes something like this, and I quote from the Scarlet Letter: human nature will not flourish any more than a potato if it be planted and replanted for too long. A series of generations in the same worn-out soil. My children have had other birthplaces, and so far as their fortunes may be within my control, shall strike their roots into unaccustomed earth. This is from where Lahiri takes the title of her collection of short stories. In Bangla, this has a direct cultural character. You see, there are terms like ghorer jotno, ghorer bhat, the rice you eat at home. And if your workplace and your home place are close by, then you get ghorer bhat. Otherwise, you have to, make it with messes and ramnar mashis and, like canteens and so on and so forth, which is very unfortunate. And mind you, this is also very true that if you work away from your home place, you might be forced on a certain kind of internal displacement, and that way even working or studying abroad is a sort of a punishment because you are estranged from your home. But then it depends on you how you are taking things into good spirit. Of course, the typicality of assertion of selfhood, of identity regarding home is important. So for Bharati Mukherjee, now let me point out Bharati Mukherjee's example. As she mentions in the essay Beyond Multiculturalism, Surviving the Nation, this is in the Journal of Modern Literature, the 1950s was no period of the identity crisis business. One's identity was absolutely fixed. This is Bharati Mukherjee speaking. One's identity was absolutely fixed, derived from religion, caste, patrimony, and mother tongue. I was who I was. I was first a Mukherjee, then a Bengali Brahmin, and only then an Indian. So for Bharati Mukherjee, what do we find? Her Bengaliness stands out, but she isn't at home based on the East or West Bengal. You know, she never says, I am an East Bengali. She doesn't say, I am a Ghoti or a Bangal. And she says that I am perfect. But she doesn't identify a particular zonal attribute of America as her own. She never says that the Midwest is my home, or she doesn't consider herself as a West Coast affiliate. So you see, once again, home becomes not only a strategic space, but also, as once again I'll bring here Chandra Talpade Mohanty's observation in the book Feminism Without Borders, that it becomes a certain mystic place. You know, it is mystified. It is, deliberately mystified. Mysticization is thrust on it, sometimes gently, sometimes forcibly. Again, the home front becomes complicated when valorized identity tags are added to it. Let's say identity tags like Desh, Janmabhumi, Matribhumi are there. You know, like, so when you refer to your country as my country, you know, which country do you come from? My country. It is something. But when you say my nation, my national anthem, you're not referring to the country as a country, but you're referring to the country as a nation. It's maybe something else. And maybe when you say my Janmabhumi, my Matribhumi, now this sentiment goes above the roof. You know, there is nothing to be done here. Yeah, I can even kill anybody for that. You know, let the Chinese invade my territory, I will be ready with my guns. You know, I believe in Gandhian pacifism. But if there is external aggression, we are ready to fight. You know, many of you might have seen the movie Sholay. In that movie, the farmers ask Thakur whether, you know, Gandhiism is important because peace is something. Shanti bhi kuch cheez hota hai, ahimsa bhi kuch cheez hota hai. And he says that yes, it's true, but you know, in moments of crisis, the one who picks up the langol must also be the one who picks up the gun. It is necessary. It is necessary to defend your territory. And whether the enemy is the Changal Daku or the enemy is the Chinese doesn't really matter. The idea of considering the home as a sacred space is very important. So, Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta, I find her observations very meaningful in this context. At one particular place, she opines that maternal sacrifice and self-effacement were part of the social conditioning of the idealized Indian diasporic womanhood. So when we are talking about the woman configuration of the nation, when we talk about movies like Mother India, when we talk about Ravi Verma's, paintings, where, of course, the nation is feminized, the nation is in chains, and the Matribhumi must be redeemed. And we have found that even our Prime Minister has referred to this idea of, if anybody would even dare to cast an eye on our mother, we would fight back. So this kind of rhetoric, this kind of emotive rhetoric has to do with the fact that the feminized glorification of the nation itself, and in general all women who functioned as submissive yet mobilized caregivers, nurturing immediate and extended families and broadening the horizon of the home, becomes operative here. So when you read Jhumpa Lahiri's short stories, you will find that there are women who are taken from India as domestic help to work abroad. They lead very submissive lives. They eat, sleep, do the household chores. And of course, there are women who don't find themselves at home abroad. And they are homemakers, potential homemakers in that regard. I was talking about Oshima. Oshima also has an arranged marriage for Shok. And there are these terms and conditions that you have to take care of your husband abroad. But let me put it that it is not only in the diasporic context that we find this kind of a configuration. Any of you who have had, partition narratives in your family, and sometimes I would be very interested if you can share with me your experiences later. If not in this platform itself, you can call me up or text me and let me know about the kind of experiences your forefathers have had, your predecessors have had about the partition experiences, where the broader joint family got supplanted on a smaller loci of homing. In the case of both my paternal and maternal sides, I've heard stories like this, that in Bangladesh, I've had moorings in Faridpur and Moimonshing. In Bangladesh, we had these huge houses, sometimes having multiple rooms. By multiple, I mean like a house built over a one bigha land, and having several shupuri trees and maybe narkel gaches, and where jute was a commercial crop, but all the vegetables were usually distributed to the Grambashis, the village people. And we find that when these people were, according to the Nehru Accord, when they were given a settlement in Bengal, of course, on a much smaller scale, the extended family members were also brought. My brother's family, my sister's family. Where would they go? They are homeless. And yet the small domestic strife that we find never left. So my Dida used to tell me that it was my husband's house after all, but my Bhashur, my husband's elder brother's wife, who was given care in that house, she hardly helped me with the domestic work. Every morning she would get up and do her riyaz on the harmonium or the sitar, and she was encouraged. But my Dida did not know music, so she was a poor servant in her own house. So there are these, very interesting yet odd stories that remain with all of us in our personal subjectivities. So when we talk about resettlement of homing, we have to keep these in mind, that it was not always, and it is not always in most cases, a very easy thing. This configuration of human geography across several loci to understand the terra firma, the concept of the bhite, which is very firm, having roots of the individual, or the person's rerouting in a terra incognita, which is a cultural resettlement in new home, becomes a sort of a sterile entity, the terra nullius, when we talk about displacement and homelessness. There is the shock of arrival syndrome that Nina Alexander talks about, and which is also very wonderfully found in a very lesser known work, Tanuja Desai Hidayar's debut novel, Born Confused. Most of you might not have read this novel, where Hidayar talks about her homing in America. She says that my homing in America was the Indian nightmare. And because instead of the American dream, I actually experienced the American scream. So this might actually relate it to the painting by Munch, what Munch that we have on which we have a couple of poems by Plath. You know that. So Michael J. Deere and Stephen Flusty, in The Spaces of Postmodernity, Readings in Human Geography. This is by the University of South California. They talk about what they call emplaced bodies and embodied selves as manifesting human geographies from the inside out. So we are able to acknowledge what Naipaul understood as the greater hurt, the challenge to understanding the subject country as home. With partition narratives, we discern an appraisal of homelessness caused paradoxically by the declaration of nationalistic homes. So this is the irony involved to the whole thing, that when Nehru was delineating our home within the border matrix of the nation, when India was, taking birth, the tryst with destiny was happening. This was the same time when the nation was getting bifurcated. This was the same time when, partition migration was taking place. This was the same time when the train to Pakistan, the burning trains were coming and going, and there were innumerable, uncountable is the right word, cases of ethnocidal rapes and violence and physical mutilation, dismemberment, death by hunger, and so on and so forth. So stories like Sadat Hasan Manto's Kholdo, they configure the idea of fractious homes where the woman had been abducted or raped, and the zealous guardians of privacy, they have become literally helpless. Sukriti Paul Kumar once again notes that along with physical migrancy, we also have the migrancy of ideas and histories, and the split self constantly negotiating between memory and experience. So clearly, our old world ideas of home has changed a lot, is still relentlessly changing every day. So if we talk about the old world ideas where we had that stable bhite, oftentimes you have heard your neighbor's house being referred to as the Ghosh Badi or Rai Badi or Datto Badi. That has given way. Even my one of my kaka dadu in English would mean my paternal grandfather's younger brother. He was a homeopath doctor, but at the same time he had a gift shop. He used to practice inside the gift shop, and he named that shop Shopon Puri. So, there is the idea of swapna, the idea of dreams associated with your home, with your house. Shopner Neer, Indrapuri, Ashiana. I would even say that the idea of bhalo basha, in Bangla, love, also has a sort of a home configuration about it. Bhalo, good, basha, as in house. So what is it? What is love all about if you do not get to set up your basha with your loved ones? Though I wouldn't really subscribe to this idea on a very very universal scale, because there are multiple examples. Like Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir were said to be in a very deep relationship despite not having been married to each other. So of course this is not universalizing the whole thing, but there is in general this idea that your heart, your emotions, your psycho-emotive context, and your locus of residence, they have a merging point. And at the same time, the opposite of it, the antonym of it, is also there, like your home of dreams collapsing, like a tasher ghor, okay, like a house of cards, it collapses. So that's something we have found out in more contemporary works. I keep on talking about the novel Exit West by Mohsin Hamid, but today I'm not going into that because I have had lectures about that in the previous 2 lectures. I've had discussions on that. So there is this idea that your golden relationship, your Sonar Songshar, also has some association with your home, your homing involved. Instead, we also find an erasure of old beliefs in kingship ties, ancestral locations, and the genealogies of caste and creed operating now. We must also note the extension of homing via subspaces of the macrocosmic home. Now, let me also give you examples of the idea of some parallel, configurations of home. So, home is not only where you, your spouse, your children, and their grandfathers and grandmothers stay, or their uncle and aunties stay. If you happen to live in a large house, like for instance, this house where I am currently there, this house, it's a huge house, let me mention. So we have an attic, which is unused, and we also have a study on top. I don't go to that study because it gives me that mad woman in the attic feeling. I keep on feeling that Bertha Mason might be locked up there. So I have that that phobia that maybe a study is better where you have familiarity and yet a sort of privacy, but at the same time a familiarity there as well. I can get people at an easy beck and call. That idea is also there. So Amitav Ghosh in the Shadow Lines has talked about the chair take, the tea shops around Gol Park. And even Rosinka Chaudhary notes in her very influential essay, Modernity at Home, the Nationalization of the Indian Drawing Room, 1830 to 1930. So this is the time period that she talks about, that the familial or the filial addas that took place inside the bourgeois drawing room. I don't know what's the bourgeois drawing room termed in Bangla, but probably it's the Boitok Khana. The Boitok Khana, also the sitting room, the gossiping room, and also a place where you had bookcases and bookshelves where you could pick up a book and you could refer it when you were having intellectual addas. And even Dipesh Chakraborty talks about it when he mentions that after during and after the 1920s and 30s, with the rise of the literary and political groups in Kolkata, in Calcutta, the then Calcutta, you had an increasing respectability given to addas. So home also became a place where the outside, the beyond, came in and engaged with different kinds of strategic, interchanges. You could even do planchettes inside your home, and you could bring the evil spirits from outside inside your home. And mind you, like there are these sayings that if it's an Omabosha night, like it happened this Saturday, after a certain point of time before the eclipse happened, you are forbidden to go to the roof, because it might be an Indian Halloween at work where the bhutas might be coming and settling on your shoulder. I've always wanted to know how it felt to have Betal on the shoulder and giving you instruction, but that never happened, unfortunately. So you have this idea that maybe during the evenings, late evenings, the woman, the married woman of the house, the grihasti, she should not go out with her hair open after taking a bath. Basically, her wet hair to dry it on the veranda. Let's put it that way, because it will bring omongol. It will bring ill luck to the household. Now, some of these ideas are very hardcore or quasi patriarchal, so they are definitely debatable. But I'm just mentioning for the sake of your understanding that the home is a very porous place. It really isn't something very very defined and very settled with a heavyweight speaking that way. So in conclusion, I would like to just tell you this, that the disparities and inequities of becoming and the existence of homes leads to an unresolvable problematic of narrativizing the idea of home, where homelessness also features. Those in government shelters, like I have done a project, many of you know that I have done a major research project funded by the ICSSR, where I explored the idea of the elderly people who don't have proper homes, who are basically homeless in that sense. And mind you, contrary to popular opinion, those people are homeless in the etymological sense of the term, who don't have a permanent roof over their heads. So it's debatable that if you are a septuagenarian or octogenarian or nanogenarian and you live in a Mother Teresa home or a Sister Nirmala home, then you would maybe be having a permanent roof on your head. But if you are staying temporarily outside Kamakhya Mandir, or if you are outside the Bardhaman rail station, or if you are in the temporary shelter in Tarapit Mandir, what is your status of being homed? Because you see, a lot of these people really don't have a designated place. They're constantly fighting among themselves, and they have a lot of stories to tell about governmental indifference and neglect. I'm not going into that, but let me put it this way, that as Mridula Nath Chakraborty talked about, there is a term that she mentions, which is the idea of the psychobabble. So it is a psychobabbling. It's a psycho-linguistic proliferation and articulation of our experience and helplessness to do with homing and being unaccommodated. And this is not only in the diasporic context, this is quite universal. So this extends to different terrains of belonging and rootlessness, in particular contemporary homelessness, which is a massive problem internationally speaking. There are cross-fertilizations of space and place. And I would also like to end with the note that I have found that trans-species urban theory also advocates the idea of bringing non-humans inside the domain of human geography. So today, when you are talking about your home, you also talk about pets. You talk about your pet dog or your domesticized cat. But it might also be that you actually don't keep a cat at home, but the cat stays close by around your house, and it pays a regular visit every day to have its staple food. So you are actually sharing your spatialization of human geography with these non-humans, and which in the domain of animal rights becomes a thing to be considered. What I think Jennifer Woolch also describes as the zoopolis, the idea of the zoopolis being a sacred space. And the Anthropocene is so frustrating at times that, see, we as human beings have not only invaded jungles and eliminated forests and entered the territory of wild animals. Even when these animals are given shelter, a permanent shelter in zoos, we find people trying to invade that as well. There would be a man with a garland in his hand trying to garland a tiger. But that is also trespassing, You have to remember that. Just as you wouldn't like a lion or a tiger to enter your own home unless it's domesticated, why should you also do the same? Why should certain places not be reserved? Like for instance, the most pristine place that India has, which is one of the most pristine places all over the world, is the Nicobar Islands, because human tourism is totally prohibited there. And so I think that is one of the most pristine places still there today, like the Sentinel Island where the Sentinelese stay in the Andamans. So yes, home has a psychobabbling experience to it, and it also has a special dimension to it. But let us not be very rigid about the contours. These contours are endlessly getting deferred, and there will be endless speculations ahead. Thank you very much. Shishir and Potik.
Now the forum is open for the scholars and students to ask questions.
So there are several questions in the chat box.
Okay, I will refer to the chat box from the very beginning. Let me follow up the questions. Okay, we have the first question from Dr. Prakash Chandra Panda. I'm very happy that Dr. Panda has joined this lecture. So welcome, Professor Panda. He has asked, we have witnessed home as quite an imaginary concept that resides in the mind. Recent COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen a sudden rush of migrant laborers from major towns and cities to their so-called homes. Can we state as an abrupt affiliation to their place of birth, or can be deemed to be a survival instinct? Okay, very, very, very relevant question in the contemporary context. Thank you, Dr. Panda. I would answer your question in this manner, that firstly speaking, home is not entirely an imaginary space. That's the purport of the idea that I'm trying to drive home once again to all of you, that home has a certain location. But mind you, what becomes the home, often gets lost in the memory. It gets a certain repository in the memory, it gets a certain repertoire location in the memory. Because of the flux of time, it becomes relegated to the past. So we can never rediscover our home in the same way we might want to know about it. We don't want things to change. Human beings are basically averse to change. But we have to accept that things change, and maybe the home also gains a redefinition time to time. So it's not entirely imaginary, but yes, you are right. There is a lot of imagination put to it. There is a memorialization to it. Memory and the idea of the memorial, the Victoria Memorial, for instance, it's a fixed entity. It's not abstract. It's not lost to time. So there is a memorialization and memory operating at the same time. Having said that, let me point out the idea of the imagination, which I talked about in my previous lecture, that the nation is also to a very major context, an imaginary construct. So to that extent, I agree. But as far as the second half of your question is concerned, you see, it's not only the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis, that has led to this flux of migrants, as we call them, and the utter failure, whichever government we are talking about, to relocate them. But there is a difference here. These migrants were basically trying to come back to their domestic homes, from their occupational places of residence, they were trying to come back to their domestic homes. All that they were wanting was safe passage. But of course, given the country that we live in, where of course there is nepotism everywhere and there is elitism everywhere, the case of the subaltern migrant or the case of the non-superaltern migrant will hardly be taken into account. But having said that, let me also put in perspective the fact that this kind of migrancy has taken place time and time again, especially in Bengal. If you see after the Morichapi incident, when there was this attempt to relocate these people into Morichapi, which was a very desperate bid to just shove these people inside that. This was not really a proper homing. When we try to force a lot of people inside a detention camp, that's what we do. We don't give them specifics. And at the same time, when we thrust them inside the Dondoko Aranyo, the forest of punishment, translated in English, that's exactly what we do. So, and we have also seen that after this, the series of ecological catastrophes that have taken place in the Sundarbans, we have seen these, migrants, the urban migrants as we call them, they come from the Sundarbans, totally ripped off everything. And they stay in ramshackle bastis in different parts of the city. Sometimes they are found and sometimes they are just lost. Nobody knows where they stay, how they stay. Okay. And so this discourse has also to be picked up. This idea of marginal specification of the home. But maybe in some other lecture, I would like to elaborate on that. Thank you very much for your question. The next question would be, Shomo Brotoshil. Do you think that the idea of house space one occupies evolved over time to become a social marker? Hence, we have bearing upon identity construction. Definitely, of course, I would never say that the idea of home doesn't have a social marker. But Shomo Broto, let me put it this way: that let's say when you grew up with your parents at one point of time, at one point of place. And then after that, you left that place and you and your parents migrated and set up a different residence somewhere else. After a certain point of time, you went abroad and you had a different home, no matter how ramshackle you organized it as your home. After a certain point of time, you decided not to live with your parents anymore. And as you started a nuclear family somewhere else. So, the shifting terrains that we talk about, that tends to give a multi-locality to our character of identity. And for people who have this, it becomes a very precarious thing also, as much as it becomes an empowering thing. It's like, as you have with Viola in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, that disguise has both empowered her as well as put her in a very difficult position. So multi-locality is not always something to be very proud of. At times it is something to be very proud of. Like, take for instance me. If tomorrow I go abroad and I settle there, I never want to do that. That is one of my least possible ambitions. But I will definitely go and come because I have several relatives abroad and I have several work there. So I might be going and coming. But if I go there and I'm questioned that you have left your motherland and you have got all kinds of benefits from your motherland and you have left her in a ditch and you have come here, I wouldn't be addressed like that, because I have seen my multi-locality from different angles, from the metropolis, from the suburb, from the most suburban places of the suburb, the idea of the suburbia, as you have with Hanif Qureshi, operating in multiple different ways. So yes, it will be an identity marker for sure, but for the good part or the bad part, depends on how you treat it. Amartya Sen will never permanently stay in Shantiniketan, but it's a place where he comes back time and time again, and maybe after a certain point of time, it might be converted into a museum celebrating him, just as you have a museumization done with Dylan Thomas's house, where things are exactly the way he left it during his final hours. So this is important. How you treat your house or how you treat your home is entirely up to you, and what kind of identity marker you give to it is up to you. Like my mother tells me that the first apartment that I made, which is in the first floor and where my parents stay, so that they don't have to climb much upstairs. She tells me that never sell it, beta, because I have my Thakur Stan here. The gods and goddesses are here. So once she has said that, that has become a sacred place for me. Even if I don't stay there, I have to maintain it as long as I live. After my death, I don't know what will happen to it. But as long as I live, I have a certain sacrality that I attach to it. So the sacred and the profane and whatever lies in the middle, in the liminal position, determines your identity correspondingly. And your other question, perennial outsiders or construct multiple identities. I think that I have answered that, so I will not repeat it. There is, along with multi-locality, the multiplicity of identities involved, and which is quite relevant. When we talk about writers, they have different bases at many different points of time. And that becomes very interesting, that they keep on referring to the point of origin, which you can never deny. The place where you were born is something that you can never deny. You might hate it. You might hate your place of birth, like Eustacia Vi in Thomas Hardy's The Return of the Native. But at the end of the day, you might find it that that's the place that so much defines you. My father does not call himself a Kolkata boy, a Calcutta boy, but I do, because I was there for a very long time. And yet some of my friends who teach in Calcutta University or Presidency or Jadavpur, they have come. I'm not a Kolkata boy. I am from Mednipur, and like Mednipur has a transitional ethos to it. Sometimes neither too local, sometimes neither too urban, sometimes neither too posh, not too backward. So it is also a place in transition, and that gives it a certain kind of verity. We have to remember that. Okay, anything else? Ask you a cosmopolitan, Kharagpur, a cosmopolitan city. Yeah. Well, Parthopratim. See, I have been to Kharagpur multiple times. Okay. The last time I went to Kharagpur, I went to the IIT for a USEFI, program promotion. And I must say that that visit was very interesting, because we were given a local tour, and I found that place to be, the most happening place on earth. I have a couple of friends there as well, teaching there. So that is a very global place. It has the appropriate mixture of locality and locality, or globalization and localism involved. But having said that, this is also true that beyond that, there are places where people still configure it as a non-metropole. There are people who are working in Kharagpur, and they say that, well, it is not Calcutta. I don't know what's there to do with Calcutta, but maybe the idea is that, is it because it's a colonial city? It was a colonial city at one point of time, increasingly nativized, or is it because it's a capital of our state, or is it because building entities like the Writers' Building and Novanno are there, or is it because the different state government buildings like Bikash Bhavan are there? That is debatable. Okay. And as far as my cosmopolitanism is concerned, well, you must remember that cosmopolitanism is not really a very singular term. There are multiple types of cosmopolitanisms involved. There is, subaltern cosmopolitanism. There is vernacular cosmopolitanism, and of course, there is diasporic cosmopolitanism as well. There are many other forms as well. So, I am a cosmopolitan in the sense that I am a constant learner and adapter of different life forms, different cultural forms. I welcome these forms. I'm never averse to change. And I always believe that life is a becoming. So yes, there are certain things which are very dear to me. Like I have reserved my daughter's infancy clothes so that, when she grows up, she can see them. But at the same time, I'm not averse to the idea that if I have to, let's say, break down a portion of my house and set up something else, I will start crying the whole day. No. I am psychologically strong to resist that. There are a lot of nostalgias at work, but at the same time, having said that, let me put it that we are also welcoming change. All of us are doing that at many different points in our lives. So the next question, cultural crisis of the real homelessness due to forced assimilation. Yes, that's a tangible problem. That is exactly what I was referring to. And that is something you can't help, There were a lot of people in Bangladesh who did not want to come to Kolkata or elsewhere or to West Bengal, so to say. But there were very intelligent people who felt that this is better done sooner than later. And those who didn't often paid with their lives. So it depends, this is an unfortunate situation because refugee crisis is not strongly dealt with. Everywhere there is the element of terroristic and militaristic powers involved in the whole thing. So oftentimes it's a case of human helplessness. But I don't know how to find an answer to these problems other than the fact that we must understand the multi-checkered societies in which we all live in. Any kind of movement, I'm not spelling out the details, can be a more damage than good. Be more accommodative instead of trying to be unaccommodated thereby or make others unaccommodated thereby. Transnational contestation. And this is, of course, all that I have been talking about are the contestations that are involved. That all these monodimensional theoretical ideas have become contestatory. The idea of the home as a singular space has become contestatory. The idea of multi-locality as something abhorred or something phobiatic has become contestatory. The idea of home as only a sacred place has become contestatory. Because mind you, when you talk about, when you do your nostalgic down memory lane operation about home as a sacred place, you are leaving out people who don't have safe homes. Not everybody has a happy home. There are broken families. There are people who are separated or divorced from their spouses. There are single parents. There are people who have been subject to Tajyaputro or Tajyakonna. What about them? Home is not a happy place for them. I have a colleague, I'm not naming him. He doesn't go back to his parents during his vacations, because every time he goes back, his parents keep on talking. When will you get married? When will you find a bride for us? When will we have grandchildren? So he goes to fulfill his familial obligations to buy medicines and stuff for his parents. But after a certain point of time, he comes back. He is happy in his mess. He is happy with having his home as a messy place. And I'm happy with him. I said, no problem. If that is what makes you happy, that is what happiness is. So the point is, these contestations have to be embraced. These contestations have to be understood in their macrocosmic significance, and they have to be welcomed time and time again, instead of being caustic and cynical about them. Thamma's topsy-turvy description of home in her paternal house, sister. Yeah, of course. And well, Thamma was a reactionary character in the Shadow Lines, and but having said that, Thamma was also a formidable character. You know, she never quitted. She never called it quits. It was she who raised the children. She, as a small mashtarni with her small meager income, she who brought up the boys and the girls. And she is the other end of Jathamoshai. Jathamoshai was I, me, myself. যেতে হয় চলে যাও তোমরা, আমি থেকে যাচ্ছি। আমার জন্য কাউকে যত্ন নিতেও হবে না, আমিও কারোর ঠেক নিতে পারবো না। Nobody is to be responsible for me. I am not taking anybody's responsibility. That was his stance. But Thamma did take that responsibility. So you see, like, Thamma has some orthodox ideas about border specifications, which leads to her disillusionment. But at the same time, she is also a multi-local victim. Let me put it that way, where she is disillusioned on both ends. You know, like when she comes to Calcutta, she is disillusioned, but she gradually builds up a home single-handedly. And when she goes to Zindabahar Lane again, she's again disillusioned. This is not the place that I wanted to come back to. But then she starts accepting the ideas that space-time configurations don't remain the same. We are on a mobile vehicle all the time. We are always in motion. So that's how we should accept things. There is something, you know, non-white literature in general has food specifications. You know, if you read Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club, you'd find a lot mentioned about Chinese food, you know. And of course, now that we are talking about the Indo-China, the Sino-Chinese, the Sino-Indian contestations, the border contestations that are going on, we are talking about boycotting Chinese food, which is absolutely a horrendous idea, because the food that is served in Tangra or the food that is served in mainland China and restaurants like these is hardly Chinese. You know, the chow mein that you have back home is hardly Chinese. You have to go to China. You know, I have been to China and I've seen what the Chinese can eat and what is authentically Chinese cuisine. So yes, when you talk about aloo posto and macher jhol, or for that matter, rasgulla and mishti doi, you are talking about cultural markers. But then at the same time, these are markers that we find, you know, transplanted elsewhere as well. You know, it might be that and they create a problematic, but the third space would in general involve about urban geographies and the delineation of the urban space. Like you have had the delineation of Los Angeles as an urban location, the way it has been constructed, or you might have Dubai as an example of a very well planned, constructed, you know, idea of the metropole. But where, once again, when you talk about the idea of homes, it becomes contestatory. because people live in Dubai. The workers live in Dubai in miserable conditions. Same can be said about the maximum city, Mumbai, Bombay, because once I had a terrible time in Mumbai finding a hotel. I needed a hotel for one day because my train was at 2 at night. So I couldn't find, because most of the hotels were above 15,000 per day rent. And many of them were only dormitories, which were very shady. So I finally found a Bengali dalal, a middleman, hovering near Chhatrapati Shivaji. And he said that I can manage one for you and let's go. But I was very trepidating because I didn't know whether he was an organ mafia involved guy or not. So yet I followed him, and he gave me a very small, maybe a couple of 100 square feet, flat hotel space, very new hotel, so that I can just put up with. And I pay 1,200 rupees for that. So yeah, and then of course this is the same city where people pay rent of a couple of lakhs to stay in posh places like Bandra, or where you have business houses in Nariman Point. So yeah, and that this also applies to Hong Kong and Singapore and other places. So it's endlessly there. So yeah, mind you, third space would be dealing with the outer realm of homing, or rather housing, but or city planning. But here I'm not talking about the outer realm. I'm talking about the inter or inner, domains. So that's the idea.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, I
Hello,
think
sir. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Sir, this is Ivana. Actually, I have a query. Can I ask, sir?
Sure. Ivana is on phone. Yeah, Ivana, tell me.
Yes, sir. Sir, actually, thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. And
Thank you.
I have a different approach, actually. If we say that homelessness indirectly dealing with the alienation, the exile, the escape, we
Okay.
can say. Even we can see that in romanticism,
Okay.
we find
I couldn't get you. Could you?
Sorry, sir. Yes, sir. I'm repeating.
Yeah. So you are talking about homelessness as a sort of home.
Yes, sir. Homelessness
talk-
indirectly dealing with the alienation. Even in romanticism, we find that homelessness
Yeah.
as a celebration, as a form of freedom. Even vagabondia or vagabond
Right.
was a romantic idea that
Vagabondism.
celebrated the spirit of wanderlust. Right, sir. So,
Okay.
can we say that a misanthropist who doesn't like to be socialized, they also have an impact of homelessness? Is there any approach? What's your intake, sir?
Okay, you see, given your remark, of course there was the romanticization about homelessness or vagabondism, and not only the romantics, the Americans have also had this fascination I mentioned in my previous lectures of being on the road, not having a fixed settlement. The hippies, for instance, not subscribing to the idea of private ownership of the home, but rather subscribing to an idea of a heterogeneous commune where everybody lived together and everybody free mixed with everyone. So there were no free fixed partners either. Now, this is slightly, extraterritorial, I should say, because this is not the regular syndrome. But at the same time, I can say that the people that you talk about, these people have to seek shelter at a certain point of time during a certain part of the diurnal circle of the day and the night. You are doing forest trekking or you are climbing the mountains. It's night time. So you would need camping, won't you? Or would you just lie down under the stars and let the bears eat you up? You wouldn't do that. And at the same time, it might be that we don't live in one place which is known to us, but we have to put up in many different places. The very idea of putting up is also homing. So we tend to develop some bit of affinity for those places. Sometimes I remember a particular hotel for the wonderful experiences I have had. Like I once stayed in Raniket in Uttarakhand, and I stayed in a British bungalow. So I really felt like a sahib, minus all the negative connotations of the term. It was so huge, the room itself. And at the same time, I recall having stayed in Benares in a particular hotel for the lack of it, lack of availability of other hotels, where the bed was infested with bed bugs, and I was dying to get out. So there, this romanticization is there, and it was maybe promoted by people who had very safe homes. Like Lord Byron talking about going here and going there, and P.B. Shelley talking about going here and going there, but themselves living in villas for most of the time. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound caustic, but it is true that if you want your homelessness to be a sort of a home, that would make you a tremendously strong person. But then usually it is not like that. Like when I have interviewed the spiritual people who go from temple to temple, I talked with them that don't you ever feel like staying in a permanent place, like marrying, settling down? Many of them say that we were married. My wife ran away with someone else. or my wife was trying to kill me, so I ran away from her. Or my wife and my son, or my husband and my son conspired and drove me out of my own paternal property. And so I'm on the run. And I said, don't you get worried? And they said that, what's there to worry? Today I'll be in Kashi. Tomorrow I'll be in Kamakha. And we'll collect some alms, begging, and then going like this. There are some advantages they get for being spiritual people. Difficult to say, like if you want to romanticize, it's well and good. But Ivana, I doubt how much, you would be comfortable with being on the road all the time. So that's why I say that it's safe to be a tourist, but to be a true traveler would always require a lot of guts, as Che Guevara had pointed out in the Motorcycle Diaries. And even then, there would be the idea of finally coming back, somewhere and homing and housing yourself somewhere. Thank you. Anything else? Let me put it. Partitioned as per consciousness. I have answered that. Pooja Banerjee, position of women regarding homelessness. Yeah. Unmarried girls in remote villages where they are made to believe since their father's home is not their home. Very, very pertinent question, Pooja. Thank you so much for this question. Had you not asked, I might have missed it out. Which is this, that yes, there are, these cases, these cultural markers where the girl's home is a vital space of occupation. Let me give you some uncomfortable examples. My own father, he is a traditional minded person, So he was very upset when he came to know, not really upset, I should say, but he is happy with the idea of sons continuing progeny, the family name, and so on and so forth. So he had two sons. I have only one daughter. And I never wanted a son because I have already had a son in my brother. And my brother has a son who is 3 years younger than my daughter. 3 months younger than my daughter. I'm sorry. So the idea is that patriarchal setup doesn't operate with me. If my daughter wants to go out backpacking somewhere, I will let her. If she wants to study elsewhere, I will let her. If she wants to do all the things that a man wants to do, I'll let her. because I belong to that generation who is flexible with that. But then I have seen it's not the same everywhere. There is this ritual that after you get married and you have to throw the rice backwards, which means that you return your pitridan and you don't, come back to your parents' house. That's up to you. I know of a lot of women who got married but never did that. There are a lot of women who don't like the idea of bhat kapor er daitto. What the hell is that? I am an independent working woman, so why should I? There are a lot of women who wear the sindoor, the vermilion mark shakha pola, out of choice. And some of them don't wear it, so it's their choice. So yes, the father's home or the father's house as your home would also depend on your relationship with your father. And also the fact whether your father wants you as a daughter, I don't know whether you are a single child or you have brothers and other sisters, as inheritors of property. That's the real testing time. Okay? So mind you, the Hindu Marriage Act, I don't know the date, 95 or maybe something like that, states that women have rights, legal rights over their paternal property. But there is a slight bit of patriarchal injunction here because women are not given rights to their grandfather's property. Okay? And when I'm talking about Tajya Putra, Tajya Konna, that's a sentimental idea. It's very difficult to disinherit a son or a daughter, biological, from property. Okay? So, yes, of course, when I talk about the home, I have to include a lot of material factors as well. And the idea of Shoshur Bari and Baper Bari, in the case of men as well, not only women, can also be treated as multi-locality. What's the harm in that? Tomorrow you get a job somewhere, you stay alone. Then you come for some days to your Baper Bari. And then you spend a couple of months in your Shoshur Bari. Fine. Let not others speak for you. Speak for yourself. Okay. Anything else? Somebody, Joyanto Murmu, Mufassil, talks about Mufassil, read and spoken Bangla, never accepted among my Bengali friends. This is a very bad thing. Joyanto, I'm really sorry that you have had this experience. But let me point out that you can't help it. We all have bad experiences of not being accommodated by a certain friend circle. It happens with me as well, in many different places, like certain places where there are coteries and camps where you are not given access. I say, so what the heck with that? I mean, I don't need that. I don't need to forcibly belong somewhere where my belongingness is not allowed. And sometimes I earn it by right. So you didn't get your share of belonging among the circle of friends, proves that they are not your friends. And teach your children and their children not to be such partisan-minded, not to be so discriminatory. And then we will have a better human race in future. Priyam, thank you, Priyam. Anything else? Yeah, Catherine Abraham has a question. Can we consider the diaspora and homelessness will be the same? No, never. But then the idea of home has a very important place in the diasporic consciousness. The diasporan, as we know that entity to be, has a home configuration predicated on different lines. You see, I have read diasporic stories where there are Pakistani men talking to Indian men about religious rigidities in Islam which they don't like. I have read stories about Bengali men talking with non-Bengali men, non-Bengali women, and getting more access, cultural access to both groups, facilitating an intercultural relationship. So cross-culturality and interculturality have to be encouraged. That is the way we must deal with the whole idea. And homelessness must also be understood not only in the romantic or nostalgic sense of the term. Homelessness has to be understood as a tangible problem that, contrary to the people who have stable homes, who are happy, not all of us are completely happy with our homes. We have a lot of problems. We have issues, sometimes issues which are never ending, sometimes issues which perhaps don't have any practical solution. But we have to find out ways to move ahead in life. And somewhere between being safely homed and somewhere between finding ourselves homeless is the space, is that universal liminality where all of us live. So with that, I'd like to end my lecture today because there aren't any more questions. But thank you all for participating. It was slightly longish. I didn't expect it to run for 2 hours, but I'm really thankful to all of you for having participated and given such wonderful observations, which will remain very dear to me for times to come. So thank you so much. Yes, is there anybody else who's on the line? Yeah.
Sir, here is Chinmoy.
Chinmoy, okay, yeah.
You missed one question.
Did I miss out one question? Yeah, which one, please?
A question from
A question from one of our student, Kamal Goharoy. His question is, how does the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019 will affect the migrants all over India?
I didn't really want to speak on this, but since a student has asked this question, I can't evade the question altogether. See, I have a rather complicated response to this question, this whole thing about the CAA, CAB, NRC debate. See, it's not only the CAA. The CAA has to be understood in the context of the CAB and the NRC as well. Citizenship is a very vital, tool for running a nation smoothly in times of crisis and in times of stability in future as well. But having said that, let me also admit that this idea of bringing people who are citizens elsewhere and assimilating them in the national fabric is not welcome, in my opinion. At the same time, simultaneously, those who have stayed at a given place for a very long period of time, related to the laws of our constitution. Speaking about that, the constitution itself is now debated. So what to say? Forcing them into certain kind of precarity. I'm not saying driving them out, but forcing them into some kind of precarity is also severely questionable. I have mentioned my views on social media time and time again. And I will reiterate that idea once again, that if I have stayed at a place for a long time sufficiently long enough, like I am a native here, my parents, grandparents, 2-3 generations have stayed here. All of a sudden you can't brand me out because I don't look Indian enough. That is nonsense. Speaking about the question of roots, where do you draw your origin from? From which generation? You draw your origin from the generation that is last known to you, the data that you have. And your data tells you you are a Bengali. But if I do a genetic mapping of my body, I learn that I'm not from India at all. My family members have cross-mated with different people at different points of time. There is Caucasoid blood in me. There is Mongoloid blood in me. And of course, there is Aryan blood in me. And what is being a Bengali and a Marathi? These are cultural associations that we grow up with. Yes, there is a Bengali in me as well. You know, if I dress up as in a suit in one particular conference in Sikkim, Shogoto Bhaduri said that you are looking like a Nepali actor. I said, but I am not one. So we must understand, like we are doing that, no? Boycott Chinese goods. Boycott Chinese goods, definitely. Do boycott. But what are the options that we have? Why didn't you encourage the local industries? Why did you put so much of taxation, the GST, on the local industries that are dying out? Why don't you allow organic local manufacturing units to prosper, more ecologically friendly units to prosper? No, you don't do that. You mention on national television that our soldiers are fighting hard. Yes, they are. They're risking their lives. But should we compromise with China by just relinquishing some part of Aksai Chin? No, that's not the answer. And that's the way we have been doing things. Compromising with our national territory. We shouldn't. It's very sacred. At the same time, there are business interests. But business at the cost of health. When we talk about the health of the people, we must also talk about the health of our economy. What is happening? Plastic eggs. We are consuming plastic eggs, plastic rice. Where are these coming from? Have we questioned? And we say that if we stop these Chinese goods from entering the market, Indian market, a lot of people will have their employment shut out. In the tourism industry, I found in Lava, a place, a hill station in Bengal, a lot of Chinese goods are easily available and the prime buyers are Bengalis. Fanciful goods. But then, would you stop buying them? You would, if you have the promotion of indigenous entities. If those goods are boycotted, that is how things would run. So I think that let's not just raise a battle cry. Let's not be banner specific. Let us look at the problem from a wider perspective. When there are so many problems related to our land, we have to attend to cross-border immigration, you know, what we know as illegal trespassing. But is border trespassing really safe? No. Is it really preventable? No. So many goods are going in and coming out every day. So when you are not safe about that, how can you talk about delineating borders within your own country? Then that's the thing that has happened. You know, we gained independence, but at what cost? the Parashuram myth, where Parashuram fractured his motherland into two pieces with the axe, because the axe will not come out from his hand, having killed his mother, ultimately taking a dip in the holy Brahmaputra river and the axe then coming out. We have the Ashtami Snan in the Brahmaputra river for that purpose. It's a holy day. It's a holy occasion. But then we are still fighting. With whom? Go and interview the majority of the Pakistani people. They never say that we want to fight the Indians. These are the political tensions that are created by the people who are very, very upset, very anxious about the retention of their political powers. So as ordinary citizens, we must know what to do, what is right, what is wrong. And as long as we stick to the camp of the right, we will never submit to the wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Subhadipta, for such an illuminating and after lecture. Now I request Shreyasi Roy to deliver words of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Chinmoyda. On behalf of the English department of both Kharagpur College and EGRA SSB College, I would like to convey my sincere thanks to Dr. Shubhodip Paul for sparing his precious time with us to deliver this online lecture. It is really a very thought-provoking, scholastic, and illuminating and informative session, and he clears the idea of home, homeland, and homelessness. And he also defines the very idea of homing and homelessness. No doubt our audience will come away with a much richer understanding of the phenomena you describe. And obviously, we are looking forward to have much more interactions with Dr. Paul. Thank you once again for such an enlightened talk. And I also
Thank you
want
very
to extend. Thank you, sir. And I also want to extend our sincere thanks to the Principal of Kharagpur College, Dr. Bidyut Kumar Shamanto, and Principal of EGRA SSB College, Dr. Deepak Kumar Tamili, for being the backbone in our endeavor. And a warm welcome also goes to the organizers of the both colleges. Thank you once again, sir. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.